Welcome, everyone. My name is Bob Shapiro. I'm president of the Academy of Political Science and editor of its flagship journal, Political Science Quarterly. I want to welcome you to our quarterly Academy Forum, in which we examine recent work published in the uh, journal Political Science Quarterly. Today, we're going to be discussing a major review article by Paul Fritz of a major book by Elizabeth Saunders, and hopefully we'll have a very interesting and engaging conversation about this. To take over from here and to introduce the speakers and to moderate the session, I want to introduce Professor Mary Elena Mantis of Sacred Heart University and Associate Editor of Political Science Quarterly. Mary Elena.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. On behalf of the Academy of Political Science and its journal, Political Science Quarterly, I too welcome you to today's forum. My name is Mary Elena Mantas. I am the Associate and Managing Editor of Political Science Quarterly and an Assistant Professor of Political Science at Sacred Heart University. This event is one of a series of launched by the Academy to spotlight prominent and timely PSQ articles. Today, we feature a review article that was published in the summer 25 issue of Political Science Quarterly entitled The Elite Politics of War and Peace. That particular article reviews and reflects upon a recently published book by Professor Elizabeth Saunders entitled The Insider's Game, How Elites Make War and Peace. We have with us the author of the review article, Paul Fritz. He's the chair and associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Hofstra University. He has published in the Journal of Politics, International Interactions, Foreign Policy Analysis, and other venues on alliance formation, democratic imposition, and UN Security Council formation, among other issues. Paul, welcome. We're happy to have you with us. Also with us is the author of the book, Professor Elizabeth Saunders. She's professor of political science at Columbia University and director of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. Her research and teaching interests focus on the domestic politics of international relations and U.S. foreign policy, especially the role of leaders, the presidency, and the politics of using force. Professor Saunders, thank you for being with us. Welcome to you as well. Our forum begins and it's structured as follows. We will start with Professor Fritz giving us an overview of the article and the presentation of the article. And then we will move on to Professor Saunders, who will react to that presentation. The two of them will engage in what we hope to be a wonderfully meaningful, productive, and reflective discussion. And from that point on, we will move on to a Q&A session with the audience. Members of the audience will have the opportunity to enter questions for the panelists to answer directly. And those questions should be submitted to us using the Q&A feature at the very bottom of the screen. So please use the Q&A feature, not the chat feature, to submit questions. We could begin, Professor Fritz.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you, Marilena and Bob, for the opportunity to write this review piece of this fantastic book that Elizabeth wrote. And thanks to the Academy for putting this together. It's a great opportunity. I'm really grateful that Elizabeth was willing to do this today because one, she can correct any mistakes I've made, but also we can engage more deeply with the implications of her work, which I think are really, really important. To give away the conclusion of my review piece, I think Elizabeth has produced one of the most important books on domestic politics of war in recent years, if not in general IR scholarship, one of the most important books. The central question I think that she addresses and what I talk about in the review is rather straightforward but profound. Who really constrains democratic voters when they decide whether to start, escalate, or end a war? Is it voters or is it elites? And Saunders answers that the elites matter far more than voters. Combining insights from American political behavior, international relations scholarship, she builds a really compelling theoretical framework that demonstrates why democratic leaders are generally more concerned about elites than the public when it comes to decisions on war and peace. This really challenges some really foundational assumptions of a lot of our literature. especially on the domestic politics of war, that show that Democratic leaders, or argue that Democratic leaders, are primarily concerned with voter constraints when it comes to war and peace. So Elizabeth's book has huge implications for international relations theory, but it also provides some really important insight into patterns of U.S. foreign policy, especially entering into costly wars that don't produce many gains and struggling to get out of those. Um, One thing that I'll focus on today a little bit also is the way that this book provides an indispensable framework to understand contemporary American foreign policy, especially the nearly unconstrained second Trump presidency, and what I think is fundamentally broken with U.S. foreign policy. Elizabeth's work really um, gives us an excellent guide to be able to understand this. So, with the rest of my talk, I'm going to try to very quickly summarize my review of Elizabeth's core arguments about elites and the primary audience, being the primary audience for democratic leaders on issues of war and peace, and think about and some of the mechanisms of the hawkish bias that Elizabeth talks about in The Insider's Game. I'll provide just a few notes from the cases of the book. And I'll end by spending a little time thinking about the implications for contemporary politics and what I think the book helps us to understand about the Trump era, and maybe in the context of the war in Iran as well and other issues that we've seen recently. So, um, the core theoretical argument, as I read it in Elizabeth's book, tackles the dominant literature on democracy and war that assumes that democratic leaders fear electoral backlash if they choose bad wars, right? Because voters can remove leaders from office, leaders supposedly avoid reckless wars and pursue conflicts that they can win. Um, what Elizabeth calls is the faithful intermediaries model, is challenged in the book. The core argument is that democratic leaders are usually less concerned with mass publics than they are with elite audiences. And by elites, what we're talking about are members of Congress, senior government officials, military leaders, foreign policy advisors, and others. All of these actors who, unlike ordinary voters, possess very specific foreign policy information on war and peace. They have the expertise and background to understand this. They have institutional access to the government decision-making process, and they have the ability, this gives them the ability to shape the policy from within the government. Importantly, they also have tools to be able to impose cost on the president as well. So elites are much more powerful than voters when it comes to potentially constraining um, presidents and other decision makers. They can use their tools to obstruct policy implementation. They can threaten parts of a president's domestic or foreign policy agenda if they don't like the direction of war policy. They can cue other elites to problems with war policy. They can pull public fire alarms to be able to cue the public into problems with a war policy. All of these things are extraordinarily powerful and things that voters who go to the voting booth every 2 or 4 years simply do not have. Because of this, because of elites have more power to constrain. The Insider's Game model shows that presidents are expending their political capital and their efforts really to shape and keep an elite consensus on war policy. Um, and their efforts are to manage that coalition. So they could do this strategically, of course. Elizabeth points out to maintain coalitions, leaders can use policy side payments, information management, and a host of other tools to be able to try to keep that elite consensus together. One really important insight that is uh, unique to this book, I think, is that leaders provide private benefits to elites for staying with policy consensus as well. This is something that most other theories don't really take into account. They only think about public benefits. So I think, just this core part of the argument, in my view, is enormous in many ways in terms of its implications. Um, if it's elites rather than voters that are primary source of accountability, then a lot of our established theories of democracy and war, at a minimum, need some revision, maybe need to be rethought in a lot of ways, or think about the conditions or the scope conditions when the models apply. Just quickly, as the book points out, as Elizabeth points out in the book, I should say, um, if elites are the primary audience decision makers are concerned with, then audience cost benefits that democracies enjoy because of the role of the public might be weaker than we thought. If we take the selectorate model, where large selectorates supposedly lead decision makers to choose more winnable wars, if we include private benefits to elites going there, well, then maybe the winnable war becomes something different in some ways. If democratic state military effectiveness is driven by median voters imposing cost on leaders, this might be a lot less pronounced if elites are actually sort of the target audience. So, our theoretical insight from the model that Elizabeth builds in this book, again, has potentially profound implications for the way that we think about domestic politics and war. She goes Elizabeth calls the democratic distortions, or the ways in which foreign policy as an elite game diverges from voter-driven models, where we get fundamentally different outcomes than what would be expected from voter-driven models. Along these lines, what Elizabeth finds is that there's a hawkish bias within elite politics. And she sort of, one of the fascinating things with the way the book starts, in the way that Elizabeth approached this, was just asking the question of if the public actually drives this, if the public has tools to be able to punish leaders for bad policy, why can't doves be doves? Right? And this is really the fundamental issue. And what we see is a very carefully crafted theory. Large part of it really based upon sort of the price and the currency of what it takes for hawks and doves to be themselves, but also to go along with the other side. What emerges are three central features that Elizabeth talks about, credibility problems that doves often have when it comes to foreign policy, and especially war and peace types of issues. Dovish leaders are often compelled to appoint hawkish advisors to prove they're serious about national security. There's a number of instances listed in the book. I'll just mention here: Obama keeping Robert Gates as a Secretary of Defense, this inexperienced young Democrat seen as a dove, feeling pressured to have a hawkish Gates in that position. It's really hard to have a hawkish leader who's faced those pressures to have a dove in their administration very quickly. The second key component of the insider's game, hawkish bias, is a domestic agenda vulnerability that doves often have because they have expansive domestic agendas, whereas hawks have more narrow, usually national security focused agendas. Let's stick with Obama and talk about the healthcare agenda that was so important to him in the context of, say, concessions on Afghanistan policy and other types of things. Hawks don't face this in the same way because they tend to have a national security focus. And those priorities are hard to hold hostage over war policy. The final point that Elizabeth makes towards this asymmetry is that doves are simply easier and cheaper to co-opt than hawks are. Doves can get private benefits from appearing to go along with war policy, along credibility lines, or other types of things. So these three factors combined, the insider's game suggests that it's politically easier for both doves and hawks to choose military action than it is to choose peace. This doesn't make war inevitable, but it does, as Elizabeth says, makes dovish preferences insufficient for war. So we can continue along these lines, and what I point out in the review is the dove's curse and the hawk's misadventures that Elizabeth talks about also emerge from these asymmetries, and this is maybe the key feature of sort of the policy implications here. Asymmetry in elite politics leads to doves getting pushed towards war against their preferences. Once there, they have to mollify the hawks with their war policy. And what emerges tends to be fighting just enough to do that rather than to fight to actually win the war. Hawks find it easier to get into war, but then faced ex post constraints when things start to go bad, right? So there's divergence here in ways that a publicly driven model would not expect. Um, and this is something that is very carefully laid out by Elizabeth with the thinking about the observable implications of her model, and then tested very clearly within the cases that she discusses. I'm going to quickly talk about those cases. I talk about these in the review just a little bit. There are 3 Dove's Curse cases and at least 2 Hawk's Misadventure cases, depending on how we count things. We have Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. And in the book, what we see, these aren't full-blown explanations for the war, but rather tailored case studies that very attempt to very squarely test the causal mechanisms within the theoretical framework, and do so very well. In those cases in particular, Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, what we see are 3 dovish presidents push towards war or towards expanding war, satisfy an elite, and doing so often against public opinion. Right, so that's the key mechanism that needs to be shown if the model that Elizabeth has is correct. For the Hawks misadventure cases, we have Lebanon under Ronald Reagan and Iraq under George W. Bush. And without going into any details on those cases, what we see is 2 Republican hawkish presidents having a very easy time getting into war, and then struggling with how to end it, essentially, when things start to go very bad, but in very different directions, where Reagan essentially cuts and runs and claims victory. And what we see is George W. Bush gambling for resurrection with the so-called surge in 2006 and 2007. Both of the cases, the Dove's Curse and the Hawks Misadventure cases, reinforce, I think, the broader claim coming from Elizabeth's book is that American presidents find it easy to start wars, but they find it very hard to avoid them or to end them because of elite politics. This alone would be enough to make this a very strong book. But I think what emerges with some really important issues that I want to focus on now are sort of the arguments regarding the democratic implications of this kind of argument that lead into contemporary political concerns. Very much to her credit, Elizabeth asked the question, if elites matter more than voters, is democracy weakened effectively? And the short answer is probably no, right? That's democracy includes delegation. That in fact, Elizabeth makes this argument that because voters are so uninformed, generally on foreign policy issues and other types of reasons, that at least this elite model of constraints can produce some type of accountability mechanism. And it might not be great, but it might be the best thing that we have. One thing that I would add to this, and that gets to the contemporary moment, is that I think there are certain conditions for that are all implicit in the book, but I want to sort of make explicit here in the sense that for this to work, elites have to be 1, competent, 2, independent, 3, willing to challenge the president when necessary, and I think most importantly, 4, committed to democratic norms and values. This last point in particular is really important for the contemporary era, because if we think about the second Trump presidency, and we think about elite politics under the second Trump presidency, I would suggest that the elite constraints Saunders has identified have started to disappear. Whether it's been purposeful or not, they are weakening. Now, extreme polarization, of course, predates the second Trump presidency, but it has gotten worse, certainly. A lot of the mechanisms Elizabeth talks about in the book are about co-partisans challenging their president on war policy issues, right? That's the most important, one of the most important dynamics here. Polarization and extreme polarization makes that less likely. This is something that is addressed very nicely in the book, and I think that what we see is Elizabeth tackles the issue of chaotic Afghanistan withdrawal and notes that increased polarization may have allowed Biden what was largely seen as a foreign policy fiasco, still achieved big domestic political priorities. That is, polarization might have reduced some of the asymmetry that produces a hawkish bias. And I think that that's right, but I think it also cuts both ways. If increased polarization allows a dove to be a dove, then surely it's a hawk as well, right? Easier. Um, and the thing is that hawkish constraints that hawks face tend to appear, according to Elizabeth, after. So what we might be seeing is reduced incentives for hawk misadventures, wars going poorly, to be tamed. There's a reduced incentive for these to be tamed by elite pressures when we're talking about polarization factors that I'll try to get through quickly. Um, Elizabeth points out in the book that when party loyalty becomes automatic and crossover in policy grounds is nearly impossible, the insider's game is one that's played exclusively in the executive branch. This is particularly troubling today, because what we've seen is that the executive branch has been gutted in so many ways, right? The foreign competent elites have been replaced with loyalists. Bureaucracies have been just gutted in terms of size. And National Security or State Department or any other agency you talk about, there are experts available. Those that are there are there to constrain the Trump presidency, say on Iran policy, for example. Maybe Iran might be a good idea. Those elites are gone. This is worse still because of the lack of policy process. This is talked about, I think, mostly implicitly in the book, but clearly very important, that foreign policy processes are the avenues by which those elite actors really gain access to the outcomes. And there is no foreign policy process when it comes to the Trump administration. Foreign policy is made up seemingly by him and his son-in-law and golfing buddy. For the most part, the Secretary of State seems to be absent from this. And the National Security Council, it's unclear will they have. There's no real foreign policy process. So there are elites that would disagree with the Trump administration and try to push on this. The ability to do so, the avenues to do so, seem to boost because of this. Finally, I would combine sort of Congress and its willing abdication of most of its congressional power, combined with the Trump administration's seeming disregard for separation of powers within our system. These two things coming together are diplomatic. The second Trump administration has flouted congressional authority in all kinds of issues, whether it's the destruction of USAID, no consultation for Iran war, tariffs, whatever it is. We've seen this. This is a disregard of the democratic system, and the democratic system itself, I think, is what is enabling elite insiders to constrain the president. Is respect for the institutions and the institutional power that is really allows these. And this is being diminished. So we might be seeing some change, not really meaningful yet, but some change along the lines of regarding the Iran war here, where there's some congressional crossover pushing back, but it's not produced much yet. And on top of that, we're sort of in this weird phase where the war is going and it's not going at the same time. So I think there's more to talk about there. But I think what's really clear is that elite accountability have been weakened under the second Trump presidency. And ultimately, sort of in a little bit of an ironic twist, I think sort of one of the implications here is that the power to constrain a president who claims to be unconstrained except by his quote own morality might reside with ultimately within elites right now, and whether those voters choose to empower a Congress or not that actually hold the president accountable. So let me just quickly conclude by saying sort of, these contemporary political implications, I think, are incredibly important. that is indispensable in helping us to understand what's going on today. The theoretical contributions are extraordinarily significant, and are something that all IR scholars are going to have to grapple with. But I think sort of on a broader lesson, if we can take a sort of a normative lesson from all of this, democratic foreign policy depends not just on elections and voters, that's key, but also on the strength, independence, and integrity of elites who participate in this insider's game. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Just judging from Elizabeth's facial expressions, and I know that that's not the proper metric, I think you did spark a desire to engage in what I said earlier could be a very meaningful and engaging dialogue. So thank you very much for writing the article, for presenting what you presented at this moment. And we can engage in discussion and shift over to Elizabeth. Just a quick reminder for members of the audience, if you have any questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. It is a real pleasure and honor to be here and to have my book discussed. And I think Paul did a better job summarizing the book and its arguments than I did myself. Very succinct and really, I don't have a whole lot to disagree with in terms of how he summarized it and the implications, which I think, obviously the Trump had not even been elected for the second time when the book came out. So it's always nice to know that your argument can travel up to the present at least. And I think he did a great job of dragging the book up to the current moment. I'll just pick up on a few themes, and maybe, I want to make kind of 3 points that I think are essentially quite related to his points, and just maybe deepen them a little bit. So one, I think, to pick up where he ended, I think he's right that where we are now, meaning the second Trump administration, is we are living in a world in which the leader of the world's most powerful democracy has basically stopped playing an insider's game, right? The insider's game is a game that is, in at least the version I'm talking about, is a democratic game, small d democratic. And in Trump 1, it was still the case that the insiders, to some extent in Congress, but certainly within the executive branch, constrained Trump, and that he respected those constraints up to a point. And they did restrain him from some of his most extreme impulses. And you can see some of the contrast. I mean, it's very difficult in studying U.S. foreign policy to ever get clear comparisons. But what we have in the case of Trump 1 and Trump 2, especially with respect to Iran, is a pretty clear, or about as clear as it gets, set of cases, right? So think of January 2020 and the killing of Qasem Soleimani, which was a very aggressive move. At the time, people said it was very risky, going many rungs up the escalation ladder. And clearly that move was supported by many inside the Trump administration at the time. And I think there was a feeling of, this is someone who's responsible for the deaths of many American soldiers and a lot of mayhem in Iraq. And so that was not as much of a kind of just Trump on his own kind of a move, but more importantly, one began to retaliate, that there was this sense that Trump wanted to keep that escalation under wraps, right? He was very much playing okay, I'm going to make this aggressive move, and I know Iran is going to be retaliating, and then we're just going to stop. And so that was where we landed in January of 2020. And in comparison, we now have all lived through and are still living through the initiation, almost out of the blue, of a full-blown war against Iran, where for a while there was no escalation control on the part of the United States, right? And so I think that's a pretty incredible contrast um, that we don't often get to make in the world of US foreign policy, where personnel changes and we attack different countries. It's really quite astounding, right? And so I think that's a long way of saying that I agree with Paul that the constraints, I would argue, are gone, right? I mean, I don't think they're weakened. I think they're gone. I think we are living in a world where we have effectively the foreign policy of a personalist dictatorship. And I don't think it's, worth mincing words about that. I think, there are many things that when I teach Trump, I always try hard to point out things that are normal or, well within the bounds of debate, and reasonable people can disagree, and not everything he does is unprecedented. But I do think that the evidence we have for the process leading up to the launch of the Iran war, or lack of process, is pretty indicative of the absence of constraint. Um, so point number one is that we're kind of living in this extreme moment where the insider's game, the board's just been upended, whatever metaphor you want to use. The second and third points are relate to the dove's curse and the hawk's misadventure, which again, I think Paul has done a great job of contextualizing. And again, here, I think what we're seeing is the sort of extremes. What happens when this basic setup is pulled by centrifugal forces to its breaking point. The first relates to the Democrats and the dove's curse, and I think Paul is quite right that it's really dangerous. And I debated how to talk about this in the book, what to say that there's an upside to polarization, implying that Democrats are able to be themselves, or at least express and act on dovish preferences if that's what they want to do. Because there are downsides to that, right? First of all, it could be that doves fall asleep at the wheel and there's a real national security threat and they don't meet it, right? And there's been some concern about that in Europe for a while now with respect to the Russia threat and so forth. So there's that kind of risk. And of course, the risk that Paul highlighted, which is that it just makes it even easier for the hawks to be hawks. But I think, when I consider, so I don't, and polarization clearly has many, many, many other very pernicious effects on society and politics. So I'm not suggesting that extreme partisan polarization is a good thing just because of this one, potential upside. But I do think that one of the things that really struck me, it took me a long time to recognize this when I would look at the data, and I kept wanting the data to, like, the effects to be matching for, I expected the effects to be matching for Democrats and Republicans, and they just wouldn't match, and they didn't match. And then, after a while, you say to yourself, oh, maybe they don't match because they're not supposed to match. They're asymmetric, right? And the asymmetry can be pretty dramatic. And I think one lesson of this book for me, pulling back, was just how many wars are started by Democrats who really didn't want to start them. And when we think about kind of the excess wars, like the extra wars that you would not expect the US to have fought, they come a lot of times, they're either initiated or escalated quite strongly by Democrats, or extended by Democrats. And so I do agree that the hawks can be that much more hawkish, but the net effect of that is probably smaller than the sort of ability of Democrats to just feel a lot less pressure to fight for the sake of fighting. And I think that is something that offers an opening for more debate on the Democratic side, large capital D Democratic side, about what foreign policy should be and how to express dovish views in a way that can be more credible. And I think it's not nothing to take away some of the, or reduce some of the incentives Democrats feel they need to fight a war. And then the third point I just make relates to the Hawks misadventure. And I think, if you put Hawks misadventure into the dictionary, I think in my mind it would have been Bush's invasion of Iraq in 2003, prior, when the book came out, that's what I would think of, just because of the scale, um, the 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 human toll, the effect on Iraq, effect on the Middle East, effect on policing in the United States, just massive, massive effects. I think maybe this one has been um, replaced by the Iran war that President Trump launched this year. And it's not, they can both be dramatic Hawks misadventures, but I think it's quite telling that when the war began, a lot of the talk on social media and among commentators was, at least Bush went through like a year-long process of trying to put some kind of elite consensus fig leaf on this war, right? He felt the need to go to Congress. He felt the need to get, overwhelming political support through this vote in October of 2002. These things mattered to him, and I think we can assume that's because he felt political pressure to do these things, right? And political pressure and playing politics with national security can be a good thing, right? Because it can force leaders to air grievances or uh, air their concerns either publicly or privately. It can unearth, that's where the advantages of democracy are supposedly come from, right? That these things play out in a process of debate and so forth. And so if having lived through that year of the build up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, again, this is after 9/11, so you would think sort of the most permissive environment that you could imagine, as opposed to today's world where we haven't had a terrorist attack on that scale since 9/11. It is stunning that President Trump was able to launch a war against Iran that every single one of his predecessors, including himself in his first term, had looked at and said, that's just too risky. And he was warned of the risks, if you believe the Times reporting about the Strait of Hormuz. This is all entirely, you can read articles about the risks of the Strait of Hormuz that go back. There's a great one by a former colleague of mine, Caitlin Talmadge, published 20 years ago in the journal International Security. Um, these were very well-known risks, and he just blew right through them. And it's partly because there was no one really willing to say no, and he didn't feel that he doesn't feel any elite political costs anymore. And so I think it's really a very extreme example of a Hawks misadventure. And so I was thinking about, so what does the apparent, maybe, possibly, kind of, sort of deal-ish thing we have now, right? Which may be the prelude to something bigger. It may just be a sort of permanent state of, Schrodinger's Hormuz is a phrase you see a lot on social media. Is it open? Is it closed? But we're not going to bomb anymore. Clearly Trump has been looking for an off-ramp for an exit from this war for a while now. So what does that tell us about in terms of the theory, right? Well, so the argument that I made in the book, as Paul neatly summarized, is that for Republicans, they need they need closure, right? They need to either win the war outright or withdraw, cut their losses, or find something that they need an outcome. They need to be able to either declare victory or just absorb the loss and move on. And why is that? It's partly because, for Republicans, national security is their brand. And they do need to be able to kind of protect that brand to some extent. And so when Hawks misadventures go wrong, or when Hawks adventures turn into misadventures, they are usually much more kind of susceptible to pressure from their own side, which is usually where pressure comes from in terms of elites. But we know that Republicans have not been willing to constrain Trump on this. The criticism has been quite mild and sort of reported in, privately, Republicans are concerned, right? But we nonetheless see Trump and clearly none of his advisors have been able to kind of reel him back in. Um, Trump himself wants to, though, and I think part of that is because he's being constrained by the structural forces that he unleashed, right? If you close off access to 20% of the world's oil, things happen, right? These are material brute facts. And so that and many other sort of real world knock-on effects have really you know, done what Republican senators have not been willing to do, possibly because they live in such fear of Trump. And that's a question we can come back to, right? Do these threats that he makes or the sort of risk of death threats from the MAGA machine kind of neutralize all these elite accountability mechanisms or the ability of these elites to punish the leader? Um, uh, so but I think it's nonetheless telling that Trump feels this pressure, and we once again see a Republican having the easiest time of all getting into war, and and then seeking something that they can call an outcome. Now, he hasn't reached that point yet, right? And the trouble he has is that it's not so easy in this particular case because you have an outcome that you can easily compare to, which is the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the so-called Iran deal that President Obama negotiated. So it remains to be seen whether he can actually pull this off. But um, I think in the sense that I sort of imagined a U-shaped, like either you cut and run or you sort of gamble for resurrection. Um, or I think he's sort of trying to basically cut and run, and it remains to be seen whether he'll actually be able to. But I think it's consistent with um, and his sort of extreme threats, you know, to gamble for resurrection, essentially. It's consistent with this sort of it's not the middle of the road Democratic president strategy of fighting just enough. It's you got to either win or just go home. Um, I have meant a lot more to say. I think Paul is exactly right that the conditions that are required for this book to for the argument to work are, you know, competence, independence, willingness to challenge and punish the leader, and being committed to democratic norms. And I think, you know, sometimes I think, oh, it was naive of me to write a book that was underpinned by those things. On the other hand, for 250 years, that was a pretty safe bet, right? So um, I think Paul really did a nice job at the end of the essay of saying, you know, what the book is doing is showing us what's been broken. And that's a very important step to, you know, it is broken and we have to fix it. So we had to know what it looked like beforehand. So I'll stop there, and I have lots of other thoughts, but I'll leave it there and look forward to some audience questions.
Elizabeth, thank you. Before we shift to audience questions, I want to give Paul an opportunity to respond to your thoughts and comments, and feel free to do the same. And then I'll shift us over to questions from the audience. And a reminder for the audience, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for the panelists. Paul.
Yeah, so it's not so much a response, but maybe a question, a further question, because looking at Trump and Iran, right, and the elite game not being played, the constraints are gone, and I think that that's right, in a sense. Um, and Trump is looking for, potentially looking for something, a victory in cutting and running. Um, at the same time, we still see sort of very few Republicans defecting from him, being willing to criticize even this deal that's emerging. You have Lindsey Graham and a few others and a few hawks that are saying stuff. But the Republican base is still largely with him if we look at the data on this kind of stuff. So I'm just, in some ways, I'm wondering to circle it back to the point that you ended with, what could it take to fix this foreign policy process? Because as it stands, the data suggests to me that there's not going to be, no matter the outcome for Trump, a whole lot of elite or mass public punishment for a Hawks misadventure. Um, so how do we, and I'm not as this is outside of the scope of your book, but but I'm thinking sort of those things are so important that you're talking about of what underpin your book and your argument. Are there indications that we can get back to it rather than asking you what we need to do to get back to it? Are there indications that the elite game, as you so clearly show throughout our post-Cold War or post-World War II history, really has this big impact? Are there paths back to that elite game?
Well, if I knew that, I'd probably be a highly paid, consultant to, the Democratic or maybe even the Republican Party. So, I don't have any magic answers, but I do think that, ironically, an answer in one word is politics. And what do I mean by that? So, um, it's common to sort of say, so and so played politics with national security as though that's a pejorative thing to do, right? But of course, national security is political, and that's not a problem. That's everything in our democratic system is worked out through politics. And we have delegated an enormous amount of power to the president, but we still, in the back of our minds, kind of expect that, the elites will be there to unearth the problems with the plans and recognize a really stupid idea when they see one. And by all accounts, they did recognize it. They just weren't able to, or willing to stick their necks out and say, this is a really bad idea and you shouldn't do this. Um, and one reason is because it no longer pays professionally to have a reputation for competence in this stuff. So in the Cold War, if you wanted to get in the late Cold War, if you wanted to get anything done on nuclear weapons issues, you had to go through Senator Sam Nunn, right? You absolutely had to get him on side. Otherwise, even if you were Jimmy Carter from the same party, you were not getting your SALT II agreement through, right? And you know, Carter was fighting that battle right up until the invasion of Afghanistan and very nearly got it over the line, right? But he was quite concerned with Sam Nunn because Nunn was the one who had the expertise on those issues. It's just no longer the case that people think that way in terms of, so and so is the healthcare kind of guru in Congress. Like some people are appropriators, some people are defense, you know, um, experts, some people are healthcare experts. And there are some complicated explanations besides polarization. I mean, polarization is one thing. There's been a tremendous amount of centralizing of leadership in Congress, weakening of the power of committees and committee chairmanships, which means like it used to be that if you wanted to run for president, you had to do a stint on the Foreign Relations Committee, or the Armed Services Committee. If you wanted to run from Congress, it's not really a desirable committee anymore, right? Just for purely political reasons. And that's a serious problem because if you completely decouple politics and political incentives, which are, again, normal, can be beneficial, like you want politicians to be incentivized to pick good policies that don't cause disasters, right? That should be bad for their careers. And if you completely decouple their ambition from policy, you get knee-jerk support of any policy that the president of their party cooks up or opposition, depending on which party they're in, right? And so we need to somehow reconnect the politics of uh, getting ahead with the politics of national security. So that's what I mean when I say politics is the solution. Paths back there, I think, are really difficult. And, if the Iran war doesn't lead to some kind of a reckoning, it's hard to imagine what would. I mean, I still think that the Iraq war did not lead to a proper reckoning. Crises and failures are typically what cause, reform and change if you think of Vietnam and Watergate, those reforms. And my sort of working hypothesis is that the 2008 financial crisis stepped on that moment, and we just never got, like, the bandwidth was chewed up by the financial crisis, and so the debacle of Iraq was never properly, there was no real reform effort. Um, One would hope that this would be different, but as with a lot of things in our current politics, I would say, um, don't hold your breath. But I will just end on one kind of more maybe positive note. So, as with so many things with Trump, the trends are were already in motion, or there's a real thing in politics that he has then seized on and taken to an extreme. I think the side payments that I talk about in the book, which are a really important part of politics that seem extremely unsavory, like nobody likes to say, to admit, like, I'll support your war if you build a bridge in my district. And in fact, that's probably never actually said out loud. Like, I can't, there's very few times where you actually, maybe sometimes Lyndon Johnson telephone transcripts, right? But they would never write it down, that they had made this deal. But you do see political favors. You do see, the absence of actions that would be harmful, like refraining from doing something. Um, this is how politics works, right? It's bargaining and log rolling, and war is no different, right? Dick Gephardt provided Bush with the, compromise resolution that Bush was after on Iraq, because Gephardt got the benefit, the side payment of looking credible and tough on national security because he wanted to run for president, right? Um, that's a normal part of politics. What's not normal is corruption, right? Outright corruption. And so I think we've got this side payment mechanism that's now curdled into direct, support my war and you can get rich from insider trading kind of thing. And so possibly starting there with working back towards a more sort of normal range of what's allowed for side payments might be a place to start.
Thank you. I'm going to shift us over a little bit to questions from the audience, and I'm going to start with a question that highlights how incredibly insightful, I'm quoting directly, your book is, and this particular member of the audience wanted to really highlight that. The question reads as follows. I was wondering if you could speak to the role of social psychological factors in shaping how elites manage decisions. For example, the current elites, as defined, I would wager, are highly shaped and informed by their own predisposed biases in foreign policy making. I wonder here about the psychological process biases that attenuate these elite assumptions, either on the basis of evaluating Iran or evaluating a non-Western country. Maybe the elite consensus was that Iran to them was never supposed to be capable of putting up such a staunch as sail, and within this, maybe psychological predispositions contributed to this. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you believe that there are social psychological factors that shape how elites manage decisions?
Yes, I mean, I think, in short, I think there's rich evidence from political psychologists. My colleague and the dean of SIPA at Columbia, the School of International and Public Affairs, Karen Yahi-Milo, has written eloquently on this. That there's social psychological factors, so sort of in group, out group, like we're the mighty Americans and the Iranians are the evil other, and they couldn't possibly then be as powerful as us. And we've made this mistake over and over and over in the history of American foreign policy, as I'm sure you know. And it's exacerbated by the gutting of expertise, right? So you not only do you have the lack of, say, nuclear weapons expertise that was on display when Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner took the lead in the negotiations in Geneva on the eve of the war, and apparently didn't even recognize some of the concessions, the importance of some of the concessions that the Iranians offered them, because they didn't take any nuclear experts with them. But the gutting of the State Department, and especially of the country expertise and the regional expertise, is, I think, again, it's an extreme example of what has happened many times in the course of American foreign policy. It was true in Vietnam, didn't understand our adversary, didn't understand the basic setup that they were fighting for their own, national unity, and that they could withstand whatever, they fighting for that would always matter more to them than our objectives in Vietnam. And so they outlasted us, right? Here you don't have that same, it's different. You're fighting a regime that is brutal, that is completely at odds with its own people, doesn't care about their well-being. There's nothing, I mean, one should not be uh, um, at all romantic about Iran, right? Or at least the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic. It is brutal, doesn't care at all about its people, is holding the country back. Um, but from a purely military perspective, or a sort of conflict perspective, it's a very similar setup where time is on their side. Their objective is to survive. Our objective is, very, very difficult to achieve if you define it as either getting all their nuclear material or changing the regime. And there's lots of evidence that they could have looked at that would have suggested that from an IR angle. But the lack of understanding of the regime, I think, and the regional dynamics was only made everything worse, right? So I do think that that's an important dimension. I also think, psychological bias, which you also asked about. The late Robert Jervis, who I didn't have the pleasure of overlapping with at Columbia, but whose work has influenced everyone in IR and mine in particular. His argument about leaders is that bias is sort of what we pay them for, right? We we want leaders to have biases, not in the negative pejorative sense, but in the sense of having the ability to take in information from what's happening in the world and quickly assimilate it into their, through their experience. They take this information in, and then they are able to sort of process it quickly and efficiently. And that's one reason why you want experienced leaders um, who know what to do with this information. And that's a really good example is the concerns about the Strait of Hormuz, right? The bias in the US system, to the extent there was one, was against attacking Iran because it would put the global economy at risk. Um, was that a good bias? I mean, I think it's an example of what Jervis was talking about, right? And so the notion of an inexperienced outsider, again, going back to Paul's excellent list, basic competence, right? That comes from experience and deep knowledge of your subject, whether it's the military logistics or the regional expertise on the Middle East or Iran and so forth. And that's just been completely absent, and I think gives rise to the more pernicious biases that political psychologists write about.
Thank you. Another question. Given what you have explained, what controls are there on Donald Trump as to the use of nuclear?
Good question. This is actually an area that I do not spend a lot of time worrying about. In part because I think Donald Trump is deeply afraid of nuclear weapons and would not use them. There's not a tremendous amount of evidence I can point you to other than his concern about nuclear weapons going back decades and his unwillingness to ever sort of go that far. I think if he were to have done it, he would have done it by now, and he certainly hasn't. But the bigger reason I don't is that it's it's been the case, and it still is the case until it changes, that every president in the nuclear age has complete and unconstrained authority to launch nuclear weapons. The system is designed that way. There are no controls on Trump or Biden or Obama or Bush or Reagan, etc. as to the use of nuclear weapons. The president has sole authority, sole launch authority, and of course, there are examples of in the Nixon administration of the nuclear alerts during the Yom Kippur War, slow rolling, like the Defense Department kind of carrying out these orders on a sort of slow motion basis in order to kind of calm things down and so forth. But if that order were resisted, it would be illegal, right? If the president orders a launch, that the thing to do is to launch. That's the procedure. And it's born of really, a lot of people would argue, outdated concerns about timing and not really wanting to having too little time to make a decision. Um, but also the concern at the beginning of the Cold War was not that you'd have, a president launching sort of recklessly, but that the order would not be carried out. So how to make the order credible in order to help make the whole nuclear deterrent credible is why we have this system where it's supposed to fail in the direction of launch, right? As opposed to fail in the direction of, I wanted as president to give this order and nobody would carry it out for me. And so if you've seen the movie Failsafe, that's sort of the basic setup that underpins the logic. So I think I don't, it's not that I don't worry about it, but I don't worry about it any more than any other president because this is an unstable situation with every president, and we are just reliant on their forbearance. But I also just think in the end, Trump was still, for all the aggressiveness of the Iran war, Trump did not put boots on the ground, right? I just think nuclear weapons is a line he would not cross, at least not in a first use situation.
In one final question, and with this one, you could both weigh in. It's a question that attempts to kind of look forward in the looking at the post-Trump moment. If the next administration wants to once again play the insider's game, can the game be played? Or have the elites changed drastically and the conditions are no longer kind of optimal for the game to be played, even if the administration wants to play?
It's a great question. I would love to hear Paul's answer because do you want to go first or you want me to try to tackle it first?
Let me go very briefly and probably give you lots of opportunities to correct what I have to say or improve upon what I say. But it's a great question, and in some ways, the elites changed so much that they can't play the insider's game. What's necessary? I go a little bit back to what Elizabeth was saying, is that the politics have changed in a way, and the political incentives have changed in a way for the elites to be able to. That's not how elites are getting ahead right now. So the one thing that I think that, and this is related, and this is something I kind of wanted to bring up in this context and other too, is if democracy is so important and we have all of these threats to democracy and we have all of these measures that talk about how we're not very democratic anymore. I see similarities in terms of sort of correcting that path and correcting the elite's path in some ways, in terms of a big shock to the system, in terms of an electoral shock to the system is necessary to be able to do that. And I'll leave it at that and let Elizabeth expand further on some of those ideas.
Yeah, and this is a nice way to address your point about the voters and the irony that the voters are kind of all we have left, which I didn't get to, but I totally agree with. And I think it's important to say the voters are not absent in my story, right? They can vote the bums out. It's not that they don't matter, it's that they are sort of we're all busy people. We're talking for an hour right now about US foreign policy, and I'm guessing most of the people watching this are interested in US foreign policy. If you had invited me to talk about healthcare, I would have said, what are you what are you thinking? I can't talk about healthcare policy. Like we all specialize and voters are no different. They have their concerns. It's not a knock against voters that they don't typically vote on really any specific issue other than sort of general concerns about the economy, maybe. Um, uh, it's normal for voters to and rational and wise for voters to kind of delegate the concerns, the day-to-day foreign policy concerns to elites. It's very rare that you get a Hawks misadventure even that causes such extreme, direct effects on American voters of many via so many different avenues: food prices, gas prices, farmers, fertilizer. I mean, there are just so many ways in which this war has had a direct effect. Um, so I do think that voters are always there in the background. It's just that the bar for kind of per giving that direct pathway from voter to leader is pretty high when it comes to foreign policy. And I think a good example was the 2006 midterm elections, which were largely, the fought along the lines of the Iraq War, although that was not inevitable. I talk about in the book. And I do think, one reason why he may be so eager to make a deal right now is because the elections are coming up. So voters always lurk in the background, and you are absolutely correct that they may need to, they are the last line of defense. Um, just as people have argued juries are actually a last line of defense in the court system today. I do think that the other thing that is going to be really important and difficult to rebuild, but that looking at Paul's list, you can't get there without it, is the competence piece. And I used to worry almost exclusively about the Republican side of this equation because, it doesn't matter what party you're from. You want two healthy parties that are capable of assuming office when, somebody wins the election, and then you need to fill all these jobs, right? And you want a bench that can kind of move up in the ranks over time. The Republican bench has been depleted because the last sort of, first you had 2 terms of Obama, and then you had the first term of Trump, which a lot of the sort of traditional Republican establishment were never Trumpers. And so they sat that out. And then there was Biden, and then there was a second term of Trump. So that's, 20 years without a quote unquote establishment Republican presidency. And it's not so much that there's nobody who could do the big jobs for, there's still people around. Um, it's all the people that didn't get hired in all those cycles, right? And the Democrats still hired those people. And, the baby staffer will grow up to become the DASD and so forth. Um, but the other dimension that I now worry about with both parties is this anti-elite, anti-establishment. When I talk about this stuff, it's not popular. Like it sounds really old school to say what we need is an elite that moves up the ladder. But if you want a competent government, there's no substitute for experience. And I think as unpalatable as it may seem, we really need to look at the damage that's been done to the competent pipeline, right? And every citizen who cares about competence and wants to be able to ignore their government and the day-to-day workings of it, that's a luxury, right? If you want to go back to not thinking about foreign policy that much, unless you're in the business of it or just have an interest in it, then you need to have two healthy benches. And right now, I think both benches are kind of in trouble. But the Republican bench in particular, it has really, the pipeline is dry. And that's dangerous, I think.
Paul, any concluding thoughts or comments? We're almost at time.
I would, to Elizabeth's last answer, I think that that's absolutely right. I mean, there's this competence combined with fealty to democratic norms in the system. are in short supply right now, and there's reasons to be worried about this. And I think that, just as a closing thought in general, um, the remarkable thing about Elizabeth's book here is that it's such wonderful theoretical work that is important for the field of international relations to deal with. And it's so empirically rich and does it so well, but also can be a springboard to address these important kinds of questions, I think speaks to uh, the lasting impact that this book is going to have, and why it's so important to the field.
Well, I'd love to just end on that. But I'll just say again, thanks to Paul for really doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of thinking through what this means for the present day. And I think his list is right. And I guess maybe to end on a slightly more optimistic note, this morning, the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, resigned. And that is, you know, has some very unfortunate, there are some trends there that are very unfortunate. And it's been in many ways a sad story, a frustrating story for many Brits, many members of the Labour Party who, there's a landslide election. How could this prime minister, screw things up so badly? On the other hand, it does show, right? This is a prime minister who had lost the confidence of his parliamentary party. Now, they have a different system, but still, um, probably the loss of confidence of his own government and cabinet ministers. That's an insider's game, right? Their game is even more compressed because there's no separation of powers between the executive and legislature. Um, but he wanted to fight. He was not thrilled with this, and there was talk of fighting a leadership contest all the way up through the weekend. But in the end, he respected the democratic norms and also the politics of it, right? The politics of his party. Um, and elites were able to put a tremendous amount of pressure on him and impose costs. And that mechanism still works, right? And so I do think it's worth noting that it is not everywhere. Our global anti-incumbent votes are, clearly a trend, populism, etc. But having someone in office whose ultimate commitment is to the democratic process, as Paul pointed out, and to democratic norms and the good of the country, which is cheesy, but something that we have taken for granted, I think, for a long time. Um, and there are not that many people who can win an election who have, an absence of shame, an absence of commitment to democratic norms. And so in the end, I sort of, again, it was a pretty good bet for 250 years to bet on Paul's list. And you may not have always liked the outcome, and been some pretty terrible outcomes, but not the complete breakdown of small d democratic politics. So something tells me that eventually we will get back to that. And, there's been a tremendous amount of damage, but um, hopefully the voters will not install someone who doesn't have a commitment to the democratic process again.
Thank you. Thank you both for being here with us. Thank you for a wonderfully kind of reflective, meaningful, and I think thought-provoking discussion. I think a lot of members of the audience will walk away probably with even more questions than they had when they joined us, and I believe that's the objective of this series of forums. I wish you well. I hope we meet again on this platform to discuss future work, and thank you again for your engagement.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed this.
So did I. Appreciate it.